All right, so we're going to be making some biscuits today, and one of the things about biscuits is we always seem to use baking powder for biscuits. We use baking powder for muffins, we use baking powder for quick breads. One of the things that has always intrigued me is why do we use baking powder? Why don't we, or baking soda, why don't we use yeast to do it? There still are a couple of simple preparations out there that are yeast risen. Obviously, the first reason why to use a chemical leavener would probably be for speed, just because it's faster. But for a typical biscuit recipe, the one I have here makes a total of 16 ounces in a small 1 pound batch, and I've adapted it. I decided to take the baking powder out of it and replace it with yeast at about 2% of flour weight, which is about what we would use normally in a bread. Other than that, we're going to make the biscuits exactly the way the recipe would normally call for it. We're going to add the dry ingredients and the fat together, cut those together, and then work in our liquids. The yeast will be part of the dry ingredients, and it's going to be used as the leavener instead of having baking powder. It'll be very interesting to see how this comes out. So here's some all-purpose flour. This recipe does call for bread flour and pastry flour, but as an alternative to that, I oftentimes will just say, well, if it's bread and pastry flour, that's basically the same thing as all-purpose flour. So I'm going to work in the yeast. We'll just get the yeast mixed in there so it's in the flour. Add the salt. We'll add the sugar. There's a little bit of sugar in this recipe. Work that in. And then we're going to work in our butter. You could use other types of fat if you wanted to use something like margarine. If all you have is some country crock around, or you have something like that, then you can easily do that. If you don't have a pastry blender, this is what I'm doing here. Is I'm taking the fat and I'm working it together with the flour, cutting it together. We want to get these particles of fat down to a reasonable size. So this is an old method I used to use back when I didn't have a pastry blender, but I had a couple of butter knives, and I would just run them through here and cut the butter up into pieces. Hence the cut-in method. It's slower, yeah, I know, it's slower, but it works. And the idea here is to get the butter cut down, get the fat cut down into small pieces, all coated with flour, so they will stay intact. And then as the dough is formed, the butter or other fat, whether it be lard, whether it be shortening or margarine, those pieces of fat being coated with flour, they will just start to get mixed in and then flattened as the dough is rolled out. So I like getting the pieces of fat down to about the size of peas, or even a little smaller if possible. The whole principle behind the cut-in method is to get a lot of fat incorporated into a mixture with flour. Okay, so these pieces are pretty small. We're going to add some liquid now to this. And I'm just going to work this together. Just like we would with biscuits, we're not going to mix it very much, right? We're going to try to mix it as minimally as we can so we don't form too much gluten. We don't want our biscuits to be tough. But what got me thinking about yeast, using yeast in a recipe like this, is that if this dough, this biscuit dough, is able to hold the air that's released from carbon dioxide that's released from baking powder, surely it can handle the carbon dioxide released from yeast. So I'm very curious to see how this comes out. I'm going to put a little bit of flour down. just going to press this together to form a nice cohesive mass of biscuit dough. And this is a recipe where they actually call for you to fold it over. Still, try not to work the dough too much. But folding it over creates the perception of some layers in the biscuits. Now we're going to treat this just like a bread in that we're going to mix it like a biscuit. Because it has yeast, I am not going to go through the whole process of bulk fermentation and then pre-shaping and that kind of thing. I don't want to work the gluten that much. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to cut this into pieces, and then I'm going to set it aside with plastic over it in order to let it rise. I'm going to let it proof. Once it's had a chance to proof sufficiently, we're going to put these in a 400-degree oven, and we're going to see how they do. We're going to see if we get enough leavening out of these biscuits to do, or to get what we expect out of biscuits. So this is about an inch thick, and I think what I'll do in order to get a nice amount of portions out of this, I'm going to cut them into triangles, just like we would with scones. Now, if you were using biscuits to make, let's say, strawberry shortcake, that's how I used to have it when I was younger. We used to always make it with biscuits. We would make them in triangles like this and then put turbinado sugar on top. And that would give us a really nice sweet biscuit for use with the strawberries. But what we're going to do is we're going to put these on a pan here and let them now do what they need to do. Let the yeast do its work and see how the leavening comes out. See if we get the leavening that we would hope for in a biscuit. So I'm going to cover these with some plastic. Let them rise. It's probably going to take about an hour or so. These aren't exactly very warm right now. I didn't use really warm, didn't use anything in the way of warm liquid. So they're pretty cool. It's going to take a little while, but we will come back and take a look at that. Okay, so this is the biscuits after they've had a chance to proof for about an hour and a half. They're starting to get a little puffy. I'm going to stick them in the oven at 400 degrees, and we're going to see how they do. They should be pretty impressive. If they're holding air now, I'm hoping they'll hold air as they bake, and they'll puff up nice and tall. So we'll be back in a flash. Okay, so here's the biscuits out of the oven. These things are still sizzling. They've just come out. And we got good color. We got really pretty good leavening here through the side of this biscuit. And this one's looking pretty good too. Even though this is really hot, I'm gonna go ahead and cut this one in half. You can get a pretty good idea what it looks like on the inside. And as you can see, this came, ow. You can see this came out pretty darn nice, considering that we used yeast instead of baking powder. Now, what's the caveat? Well, the caveat is that we had to wait an hour and a half for these to proof. So baking powder is certainly, the big incentive is to use baking powder for speed. It definitely makes things faster. But these look pretty darn good. I'm gonna wait for them to cool off before I try to eat one. But it can be done. It can be done. I think the only thing I might change is if I were to do this again, I think I would dissolve the yeast in water first. Let that fully dissolve so that the yeast is in solution and it's not just in little pellets, because even though it's instant yeast, and this is really fine-grained yeast, I'd rather see it completely dissolved in water so that it has a chance to be more active. That said, we got pretty good activity here as is, but I think that that's what I would do. That's what I would probably change. Anyway, it's a fun experiment. It's a fun thing to do, and I think that we'll just call that a fun thing to try and see what happens. Anyway, I'll see you next time.